Hello and welcome to Surveyor Says, the podcast from the National Society of Professional Surveyors. Each week, we bring you fascinating guests that are involved in the profession of surveying. We cover a lot of ground, including Table A Talk with Gary Kent, Point of Order with the NSPS Joint Government Affairs Team, Future Focus, highlighting current and future leaders of the profession, and everything survey-related in between. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast, and hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Surveyor Says. Hello and welcome to another episode of Surveyor Says. This is Tim Burch, and thought we would catch up on some legislative things going on today because we are just coming off of our annual Joint Government Affairs Committee meeting with our esteemed team. Pat Smith, the chairman, Kurt Sumner, or the director emeritus, was in with us, and then of course we have our wonderful legislative team of John Palatiello and John J.B. Bird, with Paul Miller, one of John's partners, popped in for a few things just to kind of talk about some stuff. We met at John's office a few days ago, really laid out the plans for what 2022 is going to entail. We're still in somewhat of a not really a lockdown, but we're still limited on what we can lobby and things we can do. But so decided to invite John on just to say, John, what did you think of last week's meeting and such? But I guess first we better start with, for those who don't know you, which I don't know how that's possible, but we'll see. Who is John, and what company are you with? I mean, what is your, and especially your various association positions right now?
Well, thanks, Tim. I appreciate your having me. And I'm John Palatiello. I'm a husband, I'm a dad, I'm a granddad.
Good. Got priorities up there first, yes.
But I have the distinct pleasure of being the Federal Government Affairs Consultant to NSPS. And on my team is John Bird, who's the registered lobbyist for NSPS. And we do our best to represent the interests of the surveying profession and the NSPS membership before Congress and federal agencies. We do help NSPS a little bit with state legislation as well, although that's obviously the primary responsibility of our state affiliates, but we try to lend some support in that as well. I have spent almost my entire adult career working with the surveying, mapping, geospatial community. I have a degree in political science. I started my career as a very young aide to a member of Congress. I worked on Capitol Hill for about 7 years. And then in 1982, I was hired by the old American Congress on Surveying and Mapping, ACSM, the predecessor to NSPS. Of course, NSPS was part of ACSM under its old structure. And I was brought in to be the first government affairs director for what was then a joint program. You mentioned the Joint Government Affairs Committee. Some folks use that name. And the origin of that is our Joint Government Affairs Committee was joint between ACSM and ASP, as it was known in those days, the American Society for Photogrammetry, later and now ASPRS. In the early 80s, for those who are newer to the profession, there was an effort to merge the two organizations. We called it a consolidation. And one of the bridges to that consolidation was the establishment of a joint government affairs program. And I was brought on board to lead that. The consolidation was not approved by the membership. The two organizations sort of went their separate ways. But I stayed with the surveying and mapping community for 40 years now. It's hard to believe. As a representative of ACSM for a period of time, and then I did a 30-year tour of duty as the executive director of MAPS, the Trade Association of Photogrammetry and Geospatial Firms. And my involvement in the community just deepened. I've been the administrator of COFPACE, of which NSPS is a member for many years now. That's the organization that preserves, protects, defends, and promotes the Brooks Act, qualifications-based selection in federal procurement. And then today, my duties also include being the president of a group called USGO, U.S. Geospatial Executives Organization, which is a group of about 25 CEOs of leading surveying and geospatial firms. I'm the executive director of the Subsurface Utility Engineering, or SUE Association. And our firm also manages the Maryland Society of Surveyors, the Virginia Association of Surveyors, and the Pennsylvania Society of Land Surveyors. So I have a leading role as executive director of those three organizations. So I've had a very rewarding career on the association management side of the surveying profession.
Well, I guess I want to back up a little bit because I'm curious with the political science degree. I guess what as a young adult growing up getting this degree, what drove you to be into this legislative world and association management? I mean, we all have our stories of what enticed us into our careers. I guess what would be yours and what pushed you towards Capitol Hill?
Well, I grew up in a family where we sat as a family and had dinner every evening, and we would discuss what back in the day we'd call current events. We'd sit around the table and talk about what was happening in the world. So that was number one. Number two is, I think my very first job where I earned any money was as a paper boy. And it used to drive my mom crazy because I would have to sit there and read the paper before I'd go and deliver it. So I always had an interest in what was going on in the world. And then, I kind of did the usual thing in middle school and high school, student council and class president and all of those crazy things. And then I had a wonderful teacher who took a group of about 5 or 6 of us young fellows. This was in middle school, what we used to call junior high school. And I grew up in Connecticut, and he took a group of us on a week-long trip down to Philadelphia and to Washington, D.C. to see all the historic sites. And we went up on Capitol Hill, met with our congressman. And that was probably where I first kind of got the bug that the political science field was something that I wanted to pursue. And then there was sort of a very, serendipitous intersection of things that I just always had this affinity for mapping. And we would go on family vacations, and I would sit in the back seat with the paper map and be my dad's navigator. And then I remember, to this day, it's a very vivid memory. I think, again, this was middle school, junior high school. Our social studies teacher was trying to teach the class the concept of latitude and longitude, and nobody in the class was getting it except for me. And she kind of threw that chalk down on that little trough in front of the blackboard and said, "Well, John, why don't you get up here and see if you can get through to these?" And, I got up there and I drew a little grid and said, these are the long lines and these are the vertical lines. And so that's longitude and that's latitude, and boom, there's where you are. And so I just, again, I think it may have been divine providence that I ended up in the career that I've been in.
Well, and I'm going to make this comment, and for some of our listeners that maybe don't have as many gray hairs as us, I'm picturing you as you are the role model for Alex Keaton on Family Ties. And that was just your affinity. For those who don't remember that, Michael J. Fox, basically his career start. I mean, it was a great show, and Michael had a great character, and that's what I'm picturing, a young John as Alex B. Keaton, and I think it fits. But Okay, so you get started in DC in the early 80s. I mean, Reagan administration, uh, prior to GPS. I mean, like you said, you had this affinity for mapping, but this is prior to GPS. And, you know, I'm going to say that for the most part, surveying wasn't that professional at the time. I'll be honest. You might differ, but um, I guess where was the organization at that point in time, and how did it play into politics versus how it's kind of evolved into today?
Well, first of all, I would respectfully disagree or take a little different take on your comment. I think surveying
Sure.
has always been recognized as professional. It certainly was not as high tech in those days as it is today, but certainly professional. But when I was hired, um, Tim, my first task, what they told me, the leaders of ACSM and ASP at the time, what they said was the goal of this government affairs program is to promote and assure professional recognition of surveyors and cartographers and photogrammetrists. And so we embarked on both a proactive, offensive legislative and political strategy, but also one of defense, making sure that bad things didn't happen. Um, and what actually caused my program to be created was 50 years ago this year, 1972, the Brooks Act was passed into law. Everything was fine. And then in the late 70s, there were two bid protest decisions that said, no, the Brooks Act does not apply to surveying and mapping. So that was
Mm,
sort of a, uh, a reduction or a setback for the professional status of surveying. And then there was a very controversial piece of legislation that passed in the 1970s called the Surface Mining Act. And without going into a long story, at the very last moment before that bill passed into law, over the veto of then President Ford, the bill was changed. It required cross sections and maps of plans for surface mining. And at the last minute, the Congress said that those plans and maps should be certified by a professional engineer or a geologist. Um, that overrode state licensing law that said that those are tasks of a professional surveyor.
mm,
So those were two examples of where not having a government affairs program, not having a seat at the table, not having a voice in Congress really hurt the surveying profession. So that is what caused ACSM at the time to start a government affairs program, and then a couple of years later to bring it in-house, create a position, create a joint program with ASP. So it's, to me, nobody has said, "Hey, John, you can stop seeking professional recognition for surveyors." So that's really been my mission statement for all these years, and I love continuing to do that. And I think we've had quite a bit of success over the years in at least getting the laws of our land to recognize surveying as a professional service.
sure. Well, and I do appreciate you disagreeing with me on the lack of professionalism then, because bottom line is that I guess I'm from my, not necessarily my perspective, I think the overall perspective from the public a lot of times, especially earlier on when it was just guys on the side of the road taking pictures. um, it's nice to know that even throughout your career that you've seen and held our profession to a higher standard, and I personally appreciate that means a lot to me that we do see this profession as an honored career. So I guess going from getting your start during the Reagan administration through several administrations through GPS and a lot more technology, and even the technology as you're with your time at Maps. I mean, what what did you see changing in the legislation and being uh, I guess my question is not so much we can't just legislate the tools. I mean, the tools are the tools. It's still the activities that are being done by the professional. How did the technology try to sway or really deal with the legislation going forward?
Well, what I've seen is somewhat of an evolution, but in some respects a revolution. And that is that, particularly, I would say over the last 5 or 10 years, as a new, younger generation of members of Congress come into office, they're much more aware of geospatial data. I think the introduction of geospatial data as a consumer product and a consumer service has made our lawmakers and their staffs much more aware of what the potential applications and uses of the data are. So there is a lot of legislation that gets introduced, not only in Congress, but in the state legislatures, that recognize and apply what surveyors and those in other geospatial disciplines do. It was rare for there to be surveying legislation 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's common today. And
Mm-hmm.
that's because they're using a navigation system in their car, a GPS system in their car, on their tablet or their mobile device or their cell phone. I'm very pleasantly, I'm not going to say surprised, I'm very pleased when I hear and JB comes back and said, well, I met a staffer who majored in GIS or took a GIS class in college.
Yes,
And
that's always
so when
good.
you have that kind of familiarity with the surveying and geospatial profession on the part of the members of Congress and their staff, then they're more likely to be applying that knowledge to legislation that they're drafting. So we see much more of that today than we did in years past.
Sure, sure. Well, and the reason I asked the question is there's several states. Um, Me being an Illinois resident is one. I was actually on the committee that, that with the technology, with whether it's photogrammetry and the higher power cameras that are there, it's the UAVs. There seemed to be all of a sudden this rush to protecting privacy. And this reason I bring this up is that it's surveyors are using this technology, and now people are up in arms about privacy. But those privacy laws are still, I mean, they're still applicable, even though the technology's changed. We're using this technology for a different reason, but yet there is efforts to shut things down. I guess that's the direction I was kind of going. That seems like some legislators want to reinvent the wheel looking at stuff when it's really we're talking about the tools and not the people and their responsibility of using that data.
Well, in response to your earlier question, I was thinking more in terms of the positive and
Right.
how the knowledge of geospatial technology is helping us and creating more opportunities and greater recognition of applications of geospatial technology. In your follow-up question, you raise a very good point. There's also a downside, and that is that there are actors out there who could use data in a way that's harmful to our individual privacy. So that creates another challenge for us to make the distinction between, do not track of the cell phone companies using their tracking capability of where you go and what you do with your device on one hand, and creating a GIS, for example, on the other hand, where you're not tracking the person, but you're using an address, you're using a parcel identification number, you're using a map with property data. And if people interpret that as being personally identifiable data or
Mm-hmm.
an invasion of privacy, well, that's something we need to explain, and we need to make that distinction, because by and large, that data that the surveyor is applying about a person or their property is right out of public records. We're just using it in a different manner and applying it for other solutions. So we have worked very hard to make sure that privacy legislation in Congress does not define personally identifiable data as the type of data and activity that a surveyor is carrying out in their ordinary professional responsibilities.
Sure, sure. Well, I guess a little bit on those same lines. You just talked about the last 5 to 10 years and how the legislators have, it's a new generation of legislators that have grown up in a different world and they understand some of these things. Um, I guess from your perspective, it's obviously important to stay in tune with the way that the younger legislators are thinking. Um, I guess what are some of the ways that you and JB, I shouldn't say stay young and stay current. But obviously with your staff as young as they are and being able to do media things and such, what are some of the things that you're doing and NSPS should be doing to help stay engaged with these younger legislators? Obviously we walk into, that's what I always tell people when we walk into Capitol Hill and you go to one of these legislators' offices and how young all the staffers are. Most of us are middle-aged white men, and sometimes it's hard to make that connection. What are some of the things that that you and JB do to try to help smooth that over a little bit?
Well, to be honest, it's been 17 years now that JB has been with me. That was the reason why I hired him, is I needed someone that was more of a contemporary of these staffers because, at my age, I was realizing that, there was an age difference. And so in my line of business and in working with the Congress, you need both the institutional knowledge of a seasoned professional, but you also need younger people who can connect and relate to the staff. And JB has an extraordinary network of folks on Capitol Hill that he works with. They know him. One of the things that really excites me, I'm always very proud of JB when he'll come into the office and say, "Hey, I had this meeting and this congressman is going to pursue this provision that we've asked him to carry for us." But what really gets me as excited is when an unsolicited phone call comes into JB and it's an office saying, "Hey, we're putting together a bill and we think that there is a need for some geospatial provision or a surveying provision in here. Can you help us draft something?" So that's the reputation that he's developed, where he's, a subject matter expert and he's a known resource. And
exactly.
That's where I think things have changed over the years as well. It's not just things that we have to initiate and we have to go up on the hill and ask for. It's people coming to NSPS and coming to JB and saying, "We need your help on this. We need your insight. We need your expertise. We want to do something with surveying or geospatial and help us draft this provision." And so that has really changed the sort of the paradigm of lobbying as well.
Well, and I guess the one thing I appreciate about JB and being around him, I'd like to follow him home one of these nights because I think he's tapped into the fountain of youth. I've known him, almost 10 years now with you, and the guy doesn't age. He's got that on his side. But, and to your point, I guess what I also appreciate about him in talking to him is that he's genuinely excited about a lot of these activities, a lot of these things. When he talks to one of the legislators and gets them on board or gets those calls to be included in something, he's just, like I said, he's genuinely excited. And it's great to have somebody on the team that's like that. And the way you've been able to bring him along and really see him blossom has just been fantastic for NSPS.
Well, one of the things that I've observed about the lobbying and advocacy profession is you have to be passionate about what you're representing. You've got to believe in what you're advocating. And if you don't, it shows. But if you do, it shows as well. And obviously, JB has that passion and
Yeah.
believes strongly in the surveyors and believes strongly in what he's doing in advocacy on behalf of surveyors.
Yes, he does, and well, you both are so invaluable to have on our team and really pressing for us, which we really, really appreciate. I guess as we wind this conversation up a little bit, I guess a couple of my last questions are the current political environment in DC and this. I mean, some of this little bit of a youth movement and different political directions. How can NSPS and our Joint Government Affairs Committee, how can we uh, basically leverage some of these changes and some of these environment challenges to our advantage? I mean, do you see ways that we can capitalize on what's kind of a chaotic time? Or is
Well,
anything going to get done in DC right now?
things do still get done. Yes, there's gridlock. Yes, there's brutal partisanship. Um, but in the end, some things get done. The infrastructure bill is a good example. There was a lot of fighting, a lot of disagreement, a lot of partisanship. Um, there are there's a lot of garbage in that bill as well, but that there are some good provisions and some initiatives and some funding of things that were badly needed in this country. And Congress finally came together and got that bill passed. So I'm an optimist. I'm a realist, but I'm also an optimist. Um, you never know when something's going to break in Congress and a piece of legislation is going to move. So you've got to be engaged. You can't sit back and say, "Well, that's never going to happen, so I'm not going to be involved." You've got to
Right.
keep after these things because it could happen, and if it does and you're not involved, then you're left on the sidelines. So that's sort of from our side, day to day in Washington. From the standpoint of the individual NSPS member, um, for all of its blemishes and all of the problems and all the criticisms, we still have the greatest system of lawmaking ever known to mankind. And the beauty of that process is that ultimately our elected representatives have to face the voters. So they do have to be responsive and they do want to hear from their constituents. They want to know how legislation is going to impact them. So it is still, I know it's frustrating, and sometimes you feel like Don Quixote tilting at
Mm.
windmills, but it is still important for every surveyor in America to get to know their congressman, to communicate with their congressman, let them know about surveying, and let them know about legislation that impacts not only surveying but the clients, the public uh, health, safety, and welfare. The reason why surveyors are licensed. So that's number one is communicating. And when a call comes out from NSPS, I would hope that every NSPS member would respond and pick up the phone or sit down and write an email and communicate with their member of Congress. Number two, you mentioned before about this perception about, well, the surveyor is that guy on the side of the road taking pictures or looking through this instrument. One of the things that I think has just been great over the years that I've been involved in is getting a member of Congress to come and visit a surveying office or a photogrammetry office. They love it because I've never met anyone that said, I don't like a map. Everyone loves to look at a map, but they have no idea how they're made. And so when you bring them into a surveying office or a mapping office or a GIS office and say, here's how a map is made, you have a friend for life. And these members of Congress don't forget visiting a surveying or mapping firm. So that's important for the individual NSPS member. And the third is, this is not unethical, this is not illegal, it's not corrupt, it's not unprofessional. But there's an old expression that, money is the mother's milk of politics. And so, the individual NSPS member writing a check to the NSPS PAC is so important. It doesn't have to be a big fat cat check. If every surveyor in NSPS wrote a check for $25, we would have all the
Yes.
resource in the world that we would need to get doors open so that we could make the case and explain what surveying is and how legislation impacts surveying and the public. And so those are just a couple of things that the individual NSPS member can do to help his or her own business, help his or her own profession, and help serve the public to make sure that good legislation is passed and that the surveyor has a seat at the table as decisions are being made in public policy.
Absolutely. Well, and I like your note on supporting the PAC. I mean, let's be honest. In my opinion, I've never been involved in this industry in 35 plus years that we've ever been this busy, this in demand. Let's be honest. Salaries are rising because of that. People are doing quite well right now, and we need to keep continuing this momentum. But part of that is doing what you're doing the advocacy from that you're overseeing, what NSPS is pushing. You're right. It does not. It is not that painful to write a check to support our PAC that gets us in front of the right people to make sure that these conditions can stay and that we can continue to have a great career, great profession going forward. So absolutely, I appreciate you touching on that. Okay, so we've got our lobby day coming up in 6, 7, 8 weeks, and we talked the other day about just touch on a couple things. So, what are the 3 hot topics that we always choose every year? What are those 3 hot topics that NSPS is going to go as far as our main talking points with lobby day, and just a little bit of background on why each of those are reasoned there that the hot topics.
Well, you mentioned earlier in this discussion, Tim, that we had a meeting recently in our office, which is something that we've done every year since our firm has been representing NSPS. We brought in Kurt and John Matonich was the first chairman of the committee when we came on board, and Pat Smith since then. And we go through every conceivable issue that could come before Congress that has an impact on surveying, whether it's an opportunity or a threat. And we, JB and I, get input and feedback from the chairman of the committee and the executive director of NSPS so that we are knowledgeable about these issues and we can speak on behalf of NSPS in a accurate and intelligent manner. And so we did that recently in our office and evaluated issues, looked at priorities, and sort of charted our course for the coming year in government affairs. And out of that process, we narrowed down issues that JB and I will work on behalf of NSPS, and then distill them down to, here are 3 issues that would be relevant and effective for the members to advocate on lobby day. And so for this year, the 3 issues that we're going to ask our members to discuss on Capitol Hill are: number 1, reform and reauthorization of the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program and the critical role that surveying and mapping plays in the success of that program. We have a very robust set of recommendations. Some of it is in legislation pending before the Congress already. But as professionals in this field, surveyors have some very strong opinions and expertise on how that program can be improved. So that's the first issue. The second is on a regular basis, every 2 years, every 4 years, Congress will pass what's called a Water Resources Development Act, WRDA, W-R-D-A. That is a legislation that authorizes the civil works program of the Corps of Engineers. And of course, that's important to the country for flood control, navigation, recreation, a variety of different missions of the Corps of Engineers, and surveying is a very important part of that. Unfortunately, we have seen a bit of a demolition, if that's the right word, of the status of surveying in the Corps of Engineers. I remember having a meeting at Corps headquarters many years ago, and they used to have a wonderful little museum in the first floor. And I was reminded that the original name of that agency was the Corps of Topographic Engineers back in the 1800s. So its foundation is surveying. Well, I have friends that I work with folks in the Corps of Engineers who I've become friends with over the years, who themselves have complained, well, we got to change the name again and call it the Corps of Lawyers. Because it is so much more run by lawyers and not engineers. And these were engineers or surveyors in the Corps over the years that have said that to me. And so the role of engineering and the role of surveying, not only in headquarters from a policy standpoint, but down at the district level where projects are actually executed, we've seen a bit of a decline in the role and the status of surveying. So we are putting together some legislative language to go on this year's Water Resources Development Act to scope out, or at least encourage the Corps to do a study and to come up with some recommendations that recognize the importance of surveying in their program, in their mission, to make sure that the public is being well served through good professional surveying and mapping services that are an integral part of the Corps' water resource and civil works program. And then finally is the whole issue of occupational licensing. As you know, Tim, and most of our members know, there is a national campaign from the political left, the political right. This was something that was carried on in the Obama White House. It was carried on in the Trump White House about how excessive some occupational licensing has become. And unfortunately, many of the initiatives to reform occupational licensing has been done with a very broad brush. And with all due respect to anyone listening who may be in the hair braiding business, hair braiding and surveying and engineering and architecture are not the same. And the reasons for licensing architects and engineers and surveyors are not the same reasons why you would license hair braiders or florists or people who can buy a casket for your family when someone in your family is deceased. There has been abuse of occupational licensing. It has been a barrier to entry. It has been a way to control markets. We're different. Licensing of surveyors and other design professionals is all about public health, welfare, and safety. And so we have some draft legislation that recognizes that licensing is a state responsibility and not a federal responsibility. But our legislation expresses the sense of Congress that licensure for design professionals is in the interest of public health, welfare, and safety, and should not be part of this broader occupational licensing movement. So we have worked with our colleagues in COFPACE in the other design disciplines, the other design professions, and we think it's important for Congress to make a statement that the design professions are different and that reasonable licensure is in the public interest and should be preserved. So those are our three issues for 2022, Tim.
No, after spending the day with the committee at your office, and yes, we've got these three topics that we're talking about for Lobby Day. Um, I am just amazed at all of the things that you and JB are basically tasked with trying to watch on our behalf. I mean, it's an exhaustive list, and we really appreciate what you do because yeah, there's these three topics that we're going to help with, but it's a it seems like a never ending battle to try to stay on top of all of the things that come at the geospatial and surveying professions. So uh, like I said, once again, that just we appreciate everything that you guys do, and it's like I said, it seems like a never ending battle, but you know what? I can't think of two better guys and staff to stay on top of things for us.
Well, thank you, Tim. Let me make a couple of points in response to that.
Sure.
On the NSPS website, under advocacy and government affairs, you can click through and twice a year, we file for each of the NSPS board meetings, we file a very extensive report with the background and status of this entire palette of issues that you just mentioned that we're either actively engaged in or tracking and keeping an eye on. So I would commend to the attention of all NSPS members those reports because they're actually providing some good background and actionable intelligence that every member can use in his or her own practice. It also gives you an idea of some trends and some markets that may be developing and things that Congress or the federal government is doing in legislation or policy that could be creating opportunities down the road for surveyors. And as a corollary to that, we contribute a good bit of the content that goes into every week's edition of News and Views. And one of the things that we try to do, again, is provide a little bit of a forecast of things that may be emerging, things that are happening in Congress today that next month, next week, next year could result in a program or opportunities for surveyors. So that's a valuable benefit of membership in NSPS, and I would encourage our members and our listeners to keep an eye on what's in News and Views and use it as sort of part of their market intelligence of what may be coming down the pike.
No, you're right. You're dead on, and we'll include that in the show notes as well. Links to those pages because you hit on it. It amazes me every twice a year that this comprehensive report that you and JP and your staff put out, that it's amazing all of the things that you all keep an eye on and keep us abreast of a lot of things and to help forecast things that we need to be on the lookout for, because bottom line is ma and pa surveyor out in the broadlands, they may not think that a lot of these things are affecting them, but they all do. They really all do. And you're right, is getting that message out and for them to know what the profession could be facing in the future. All right. Well, John, thank you very much. I appreciate you joining me here today. And actually, we'll be coming off of a lobby day in like I said, a couple of months. Why don't we just plan on joining back up with you and JB, and we'll do a little summary on what happened with our lobby day efforts and what future intelligence we need to be looking for as well.
It would be my pleasure, Tim.
All right. Well, thanks, and stay tuned for some great episodes coming up. Subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. You've been listening to the Surveyor Says podcast, brought to you by the National Society of Professional Surveyors. If you have any questions about today's episode or any other topic, please email us at info@nsps.us.com, and we are here to help. Visit our website, nsps.us.com, to learn more about our association, the programs we administer and support, our sustaining members,
and information about future episodes of Surveyor Says. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Spotify, as well as our podcast host, Podbean. And remember, it's a great day to be a surveyor.